The alarm on Grace Bellamy's phone rang 3 times before she silenced it, but the knock on her shop door had already started, sharp and impatient, cutting through the quiet morning air. She was not expecting anyone before opening hours. She pulled her cardigan tight and looked through the glass, and her breath caught when she saw 2 men in dark suits standing outside, their faces unreadable, their eyes scanning the street behind them as if they were being watched. She opened the door only a crack. The taller man held up a small velvet box without a word of greeting. "We need this appraised today," he said. "Not tomorrow, today." Grace glanced past him toward the black car parked at the curb, engine still running, windows tinted so dark she could not see who sat inside. Something about the stillness of that car made her stomach tighten. "I have other appointments," she said carefully. "Cancel them." It was not a request. Grace had run her small appraisal shop for 6 years, ever since she left her position at a larger auction house that valued profit over honesty. She had built a quiet reputation for telling clients the truth about their jewelry, even when the truth cost her a sale. She was used to difficult customers, wealthy widows who wanted their costume jewelry declared priceless, young men who tried to sell engagement rings that were not truly theirs to sell. But she had never seen fear disguised as arrogance the way it sat on this man's face. She let them in. The velvet box was old, its edges worn soft from years of handling. Inside sat a diamond ring unlike anything Grace had appraised in a long time. The center stone was large, clear, and cut in an old European style that had gone out of fashion decades ago. The band was platinum, engraved with a pattern of small leaves that wrapped delicately around the metal. It was beautiful. It was also, she realized almost immediately, deeply familiar. She had seen a ring like this before, in a photograph in an old newspaper article she had read years ago while researching stolen estate jewelry for a class project. The article told the story of a woman named Eleanor Whitmore, who had died under strange circumstances, and whose family jewelry disappeared before anyone could inventory her estate. The photograph had shown Eleanor wearing this exact ring at a charity gala, laughing, her hand resting on the arm of a young man, whose face had been cut out of the newspaper clipping that Grace found in an old archive box. Grace kept her expression calm as she examined the stone under her loupe, but her mind raced. She measured the diamond, tested its weight, checked the hallmark stamped faintly inside the band. Everything matched what she remembered from that old article. This was not just any ring. This was Eleanor Whitmore's ring, missing for years, presumed lost or destroyed. "Well," the taller man asked, "what is it worth?" Grace set down her loupe slowly. "I need a few days to complete a full report." "You have 1 hour." She looked up at him, and for the first time she let herself ask the question that had been building since she saw the ring. "Where did you get this?" The man's jaw tightened. "That is not your concern. Your job is to tell us the number." Grace thought quickly. She could give them a fake value, something low enough to make them walk away disappointed, buying herself time to figure out what to do. But something told her that lying to men like this would only bring trouble to her door later, when they discovered the truth from someone else. She decided instead to stall, to learn more before she made any decision. "I can give you a preliminary estimate," she said. "But a ring like this, with this level of craftsmanship, deserves accuracy. Let me photograph it and run the numbers properly. Come back this afternoon." The 2 men exchanged a glance. The taller one finally nodded, though his eyes stayed narrow with suspicion. "This afternoon, and if word of this ring goes anywhere else, you will regret it." The threat hung in the air after they left, and Grace stood frozen for a long moment before she moved. She locked the front door, flipped the sign to closed, and hurried to the small office in the back of her shop, where she kept her old files and research notes from her university days. It took nearly an hour of digging through boxes before she found the folder she needed, yellowed newspaper clippings preserved in plastic sleeves. There it was. The photograph, Alina Whitmore, elegant in a deep green gown, the diamond ring catching the camera flash on her right hand. The article beneath the photograph explained that Alina had died 6 years earlier in what was officially ruled an accident, though whispers at the time suggested otherwise. Her family jewelry, valued at an enormous sum, vanished from her estate before her relatives could claim it. No one was ever charged. The case went cold. Grace sat back in her chair, her heart pounding. She had a stolen ring belonging to a dead woman sitting in a velvet box on her appraisal table, and the men who wanted it valued were clearly connected to something far more dangerous than an ordinary estate sale. She thought about calling the police, but hesitated. She had no proof beyond an old article and her own memory. The men would return in a few hours, and if she involved the authorities without evidence, she risked putting herself in danger without any guarantee of protection. She needed to think clearly. As she sat turning the problem over in her mind, a knock sounded at the back door, softer this time, almost polite. Grace froze. She was not expecting anyone at the back entrance. She approached cautiously and looked through the small window. A man stood there alone, tall, dressed simply in a dark coat, his posture straight and controlled. He did not look like the two men who had come earlier. There was something different about him, a quiet authority that did not need to raise its voice to be obeyed. "I know you have the ring," he said through the door, his tone even. "I am not here to hurt you. I need to speak with you." Grace's hand hovered over the lock. Every instinct told her to call for help, but something about his voice, steady and low, made her pause. She opened the door only slightly, keeping the chain fastened. "Who are you?" "My name is Damien Voss," he said. "The ring your shop is holding belongs to my family. I would like it returned, and I would like to understand how it came into the hands of the men who brought it to you." Grace studied him through the narrow gap. His eyes were dark, focused, and there was an exhaustion behind them that surprised her, something heavier than simple anger over a missing ring. "How do I know you're telling the truth?" she asked. Damien reached slowly into his coat and withdrew a small photograph, worn at the corners. He held it up so she could see it clearly. It was the same photograph from the newspaper, only uncropped. The young man standing beside Alina Whitmore, his face no longer hidden, was unmistakably Damien, years younger, but the same sharp features, the same quiet intensity in his eyes. Grace's pulse quickened. "You knew her." "She was my mother," Damien said, and for a moment his composed expression cracked, just slightly, enough for Grace to see the grief buried underneath years of control. "That ring was the last gift my father gave her before he died. After she was killed, everything she owned disappeared within days. I have spent 6 years trying to find even one piece of it." Grace unlatched the chain and let him inside, closing the door quickly behind him. The shop felt smaller with him standing in it, though he made no move to threaten her, no attempt to demand the ring by force. He simply waited, watching her with an intensity that made her feel like the only person in the room mattered. "The men who brought it to me," Grace said. "They wanted an appraisal. They said they would return this afternoon." Damien's expression darkened. "Marchetti men. I recognized the description the moment my contact told me a ring matching this description had surfaced at a small appraisal shop this morning. They must have found it during a recent search of a storage unit connected to my mother's estate lawyer, a man who disappeared not long after she died." Grace felt a chill move through her. "You think this lawyer was involved in her death?" "I think a great many people wanted access to what my mother controlled before she died," Damien said carefully. "And I think the truth has been buried under enough lies that even I do not know the full shape of it yet. But I know this ring is real, and I know it belongs to me." Grace walked to her office and returned with the velvet box. She held it for a moment, feeling the weight of the decision in her hands. She could give it to him and be done with this frightening morning entirely. She could also call the police the moment he left, and let the authorities sort out ownership through proper channels. protecting herself from any accusation of wrongdoing. But looking at Damien's face, at the raw need behind his composed exterior, she felt something shift in her chest. This was not simply a business transaction. This was a man trying to reclaim a piece of his mother that violent men had stolen not once but twice. "I believe you," she said quietly and held out the box. Damien took it carefully, his fingers brushing hers for just a moment. He opened the box and stared down at the ring in silence, his throat working as he swallowed hard. When he finally looked up at her, his eyes were bright with something Grace had not expected to see in a stranger who had walked into her shop through the back door. "You could have kept this," he said. "You could have sold it to the men who came first, or called the police and let strangers decide who deserved it. Why did you give it to me?" Grace considered the question honestly before answering. "Because it never belonged to anyone else. It belonged to your mother, and now it belongs to you. I do jewelry appraisals for a living, Mr. Voss, but I did not get into this work to help people profit from stolen grief." Something in Damien's expression softened, though the tension in his shoulders remained. "The Marchetti men will return this afternoon expecting an answer. When they find nothing here, they will not simply walk away. You need to leave this shop today and not return until I tell you it is safe." Grace felt a fresh wave of fear rise in her chest. "This is my business, my livelihood. I cannot just disappear." "If you stay, you will be in danger because of a decision that was never yours to make," Damien said, his voice firm but not unkind. "Let me protect you while this is resolved. I will not ask for anything more than your trust." Grace looked around her small shop, the place she had built with years of careful, honest work, and felt the weight of an impossible choice settle over her. Outside, the street had gone quiet, but she could not shake the feeling that the black car from that morning was still out there somewhere, waiting. "Give me 1 hour to gather what I need," she said finally. Damien nodded, slipping the ring box into his coat pocket. "I will be outside. And Miss Bellamy, whatever happens next, I want you to know that what you did this morning, giving this back without asking for anything, is something I have not encountered in a very long time." As Grace moved through her shop, quickly gathering important files and locking away her most valuable pieces, she could not stop thinking about the strange turn her ordinary Tuesday had taken. She had started the day expecting routine appraisals and quiet paperwork. Instead, she now found herself tangled in a story that involved a murdered woman, a missing fortune, and a man whose eyes held both danger and desperate honesty in equal measure. She did not yet know how deep this would go, how many more secrets waited beneath the surface of Alina Whitmore's death, or how much her own life was about to change because of one small, stolen ring. But as she locked her front door and stepped out onto the sidewalk where Damien waited beside a plain black sedan, she understood one thing clearly. There was no going back to the quiet life she had known that morning. The black car from earlier was gone from its spot at the curb, but Damien's eyes kept moving across the street, watching every parked vehicle, every pedestrian, every shadow near the buildings. He opened the passenger door for her without a word, and Grace hesitated only a moment before climbing inside, her heart pounding with a mixture of fear and something else she could not quite name. As the car pulled away from the curb, Grace glanced back once at her shop, wondering when, or if, she would see it again. Beside her, Damien remained silent, his jaw tight, his eyes fixed on the road ahead, already calculating the next move in a game that had begun long before Grace ever opened her door that morning. Neither of them spoke as the city passed by outside the windows, but the silence between them felt heavy with everything left unsaid. And somewhere behind them, in the quiet streets of the neighborhood Grace had called home for years, the Marchetti men were already discovering that the ring and the woman who had held it were gone. Grace watched the buildings blur past, her fingers pressed together in her lap to keep them from trembling. She thought of her small shop, the bell above the door, the soft lamp she always left burning on the counter so the street looked warm at night. She thought of her assistant, a young woman named Charlotte who would arrive within the hour expecting to open as usual, with no idea what had happened before dawn. "I need to call someone," Grace said suddenly. "My assistant. She cannot walk into that shop not knowing what is happening." Damien glanced at her, then nodded once. "Call her. Tell her to lock the doors and go home. Tell her nothing else." Grace's hands shook as she dialed. Charlotte answered on the second ring, cheerful and unaware, and Grace forced her voice into something steady as she gave the instructions Damien had suggested, keeping every detail vague. When she hung up, she let out a breath she had not realized she was holding. "She will be safe," Damien said, as if reading the fear behind her silence. "The Marchetti family has no interest in her. Their attention will be on the ring and now on you." "That is supposed to comfort me." A faint, humorless smile crossed his face. "No, it is supposed to be honest. I find that people trust honesty more than comfort, even when it frightens them." Grace studied his profile as he drove, the sharp line of his jaw, the way his hands gripped the wheel with quiet control rather than tension. He did not look like the men who had come to her shop earlier that morning, loud and threatening. His danger was quieter, deeper, the kind that came from a man who had learned long ago that violence rarely needed to be announced to be effective. "Where are we going?" she asked. "Somewhere safe for now. A property outside the city that very few people know belongs to me." He paused, glancing at her briefly. "I will not keep you there against your will, Miss Bellamy. Once this is resolved, you are free to return to your life. I only ask for enough time to make certain you are not in danger because of what you did for me this morning." Grace turned to look out the window again, watching the city give way slowly to quieter roads lined with tall trees. She thought about Eleanor Whitmore, a woman she had never met, whose photograph had haunted a folder in her office for years without Grace ever understanding why she kept it. Perhaps some part of her had always known this story was not finished. "Tell me about her," Grace said quietly. "Your mother." Damien's hands tightened slightly on the wheel, but he did not refuse the question. "She was strong, stronger than anyone gave her credit for. She built half of what my family has today, though history remembers only the men who stood beside her. She loved that ring because my father gave it to her during the hardest year of their marriage, when everyone expected them to fail. She used to say it reminded her that difficult things could still become beautiful." Grace felt an unexpected tightness in her throat, and after she died, everything fell apart quickly. People who claimed to love her disappeared the moment there was nothing left to gain. Others stayed only to take what they could before anyone stopped them. His voice remained level, but Grace could hear the years of buried anger beneath it. "I promised myself I would recover what was hers, no matter how long it took." The car turned down a long gravel drive lined with old oak trees, leading toward a stone house set far back from the road, quiet and unassuming despite its size. Grace realized as the car came to a stop that she had crossed some invisible line that morning, stepping out of her ordinary life and into a world she did not fully understand yet, one shaped by loss, loyalty, and danger that had not finished revealing itself. Damien shut off the engine and turned to face her fully for the first time since they had left the city. "Thank you," he said simply, "for trusting me with the truth today. I do not know many people who would have done the same." Grace held his gaze, feeling the strange pull of a man whose grief and control lived so closely together. "I think we are both about to find out what kind of trouble that trust has bought us," she said. Outside, the wind moved through the tall oak trees, and somewhere far behind them, in the city they had left, the Marchetti family was already making calls, already setting new plans into motion, unaware that the woman who had returned Damien Voss's ring had just placed herself directly into the center of a war she never asked to join. Grace woke to the sound of raised voices somewhere below the bedroom she had been given, and for a moment she forgot where she was. The unfamiliar ceiling, the heavy curtains blocking the morning light, the distant hum of an argument in a language she almost recognized brought the memory of the previous day crashing back all at once. She sat up quickly, heart racing, and reached for the robe someone had left folded at the end of the bed. The voices belonged to Damien and another man, their words sharp and clipped as she crept toward the top of the staircase. She caught fragments through the old house's thin walls, enough to understand that something had gone wrong overnight. "They found the shop empty," the unfamiliar voice was saying. "No ring, no appraiser. They know she left with you." "Then we move faster than they expect," Damien answered, his voice controlled but edged with tension Grace had not heard from him the day before. Grace descended the stairs slowly, unwilling to remain hidden while decisions were made about her safety without her presence. Both men turned as she reached the bottom step. The stranger was younger than Damien, dressed less formally, with restless eyes that studied Grace like she was a problem still being solved. "This is Grace Bellamy," Damien said simply. "Grace, this is Julian, someone I trust." Julian gave her a short nod, though his expression remained guarded. "You are the appraiser who gave the ring back." "I am," Grace said, lifting her chin slightly against the judgment she heard buried in his tone. "Brave," Julian said, "or foolish. The Marchetti family does not forget people who cross them, even by accident." "Enough," Damien said, his voice quiet but final. Julian fell silent immediately, and Grace understood in that moment exactly how much authority Damien carried, even among men who clearly were not afraid of much. Over a breakfast neither of them truly ate, Damien explained what Julian's information meant. The Marchetti men who had visited Grace's shop reported directly to Victor Marchetti, the head of a rival family that had spent years trying to weaken Damien's organization through smaller, quieter attacks rather than open conflict. The ring, it turned out, had surfaced during a Marchetti search of an old storage facility connected to the disappeared estate lawyer, a man named Adrian Cole, who had vanished 6 years earlier along with most of Eleanor Whitmore's remaining assets. "You think Victor Marchetti was involved in your mother's death," Grace said carefully. "I think Victor Marchetti benefits from every unanswered question surrounding it," Damien replied. "Whether his hands were on it directly, or whether he simply took advantage of the chaos afterward, I intend to find out." Grace pushed her plate aside, appetite gone. "And where do I fit into this now?" "You said I would be free to leave once this was resolved." "You will be," Damien said, though something in his expression suggested the promise came with more complication than he wanted to admit. "But leaving now, with the Marchetti family aware of your involvement, would be more dangerous than staying until we understand what they know." Grace wanted to argue, wanted to insist that this was not her fight, that she had simply done the right thing by returning stolen property to its rightful owner. But she also remembered the tightness in the taller man's jaw when he threatened her in her own shop, and she knew, with an uncomfortable certainty, that walking away now might not be as simple as it should have been. Over the following days, Grace found herself settling into an uneasy rhythm inside the stone house. Damien left frequently, always with Julian or another quiet, watchful man trailing behind him, and returned late with tension carved into his features that he tried, not entirely successfully, to hide from her. Grace occupied her hours exploring the house's library, a room filled with old books that smelled of dust and years of careful collection, and found herself, more than once, thinking about the man whose home this clearly was, though he rarely spoke of himself directly. She learned the rhythm of the house slowly. A housekeeper named Margaret arrived each morning to prepare meals and left again before dusk, offering Grace polite but distant conversation that never strayed into questions about who she was or why she was staying. Grace understood, without being told directly, that discretion was simply how things worked here, an unspoken rule everyone in Damien's orbit seemed to follow without question. On the third day, restless from being confined indoors, Grace wandered out to the gardens behind the house, where overgrown rose bushes climbed along a stone wall in tangled, beautiful disorder. She found a pair of garden shears in a small shed and began trimming the dead branches without thinking much about it, grateful for something ordinary to occupy her hands after days of tension and uncertainty. She did not hear Damien approach until his shadow fell across the roses beside her. "My mother planted these," he said, watching her work. "No one has touched them properly in years." Grace paused, shears in hand, suddenly self-conscious. "I am sorry. I should have asked before touching anything that belonged to her." "Do not apologize," Damien said, something unreadable crossing his face as he looked at the roses. She would have liked seeing someone care for them again. They worked together for a while after that, an unspoken truce settling between them as they cleared away dead growth and tied back the wild vines threatening to overtake the wall. Grace found herself relaxing in a way she had not expected, laughing quietly when a thorn caught her sleeve, and Damien, without thinking, reached over to free the fabric with surprising gentleness for a man whose hands she knew were capable of far more dangerous things. "You are not what I expected," Grace admitted as they finally stepped back to admire their work. "What did you expect?" Damien asked, arching an eyebrow. "Someone colder, harder. The stories about men like you are never kind." "The stories are not entirely wrong," Damien said quietly, his humor fading. "I have done things I am not proud of, Grace. I will not pretend otherwise to make myself more comfortable in your eyes." Grace studied him carefully. "I am not asking you to pretend. I am only saying that whoever you are with me right now, in this garden, is not the man those stories describe." Damien did not answer immediately, but something in his posture eased, as though her words had lifted a weight he carried without realizing how heavy it had become. It was during one of these quiet evenings that Damien found her curled in a worn leather chair, a book open but unread in her lap, her attention drifting toward the window and the darkening property outside. "You are not reading," he observed, settling into the chair across from her. "I am thinking," Grace admitted, "about all of this. About how strange it is that returning a ring turned my whole life upside down in less than a week." Damien was quiet for a moment, studying her with an expression she was beginning to recognize, careful, measuring, though softer now than it had been during their first meeting. "Do you regret it?" Grace considered the question honestly. "No, I regret that doing the right thing came with this much danger attached, but I do not regret giving it back." "Most people would have kept it," Damien said, "or sold information about it to the highest bidder. You did neither. I told you before, I did not build my business on other people's stolen grief." She met his eyes steadily. "You keep acting surprised by that, like honesty is something rare enough to study." "In my world it is," Damien said, and for the first time Grace heard something almost vulnerable beneath his controlled tone. "Everyone around me wants something. Loyalty is currency, not virtue. I have learned to expect it, even from people who claim to care about me." "That sounds lonely," Grace said quietly. Damien's jaw tightened slightly, and for a moment Grace thought she had pushed too far, said something too personal for a man who guarded himself as carefully as he guarded his organization. But instead of retreating, he surprised her by answering honestly. "It is," he admitted. "I have not said that aloud to anyone in a very long time." The silence that followed felt different from the tense, careful silences of the past few days. It stretched between them, comfortable in a way Grace had not expected, filled with an understanding that neither of them fully voiced. She found herself studying the lines of exhaustion around his eyes, the weight he carried so quietly that most people probably never noticed it at all. "Tell me something true," Grace said suddenly, "something you have not told anyone else." Damien looked at her for a long moment, as if weighing whether to trust her with something more than facts about a case, more than instructions for her safety. "I used to hate this house," he said finally. "My mother brought me here every summer when I was young, before everything with my family became what it is now. After she died, I could not bring myself to sell it, though I avoided it for years. I only started staying here again recently, and I am still not certain why." "Maybe because it still feels like hers," Grace offered gently. Something shifted in Damien's expression, a softness Grace had not seen from him before. "Maybe," he agreed quietly. That evening, over a dinner Margaret had left warming in the kitchen, Grace asked Damien questions she had been holding back since her first night in the house. She asked about his father, and learned that he had died when Damien was still a teenager, leaving behind an organization that others had tried to seize before Damien was old enough to defend his inheritance. She asked how he had survived those early years, and Damien answered honestly, describing nights spent studying every rival's weakness, every alliance that could be turned, every mistake he could not afford to repeat. "It sounds exhausting," Grace said. "It was," Damien admitted. "It still is most days, but it taught me to recognize the difference between people who serve loyalty and people who serve fear. Julian belongs to the first group. Most others belong to the second." "And which group do I belong to?" Grace asked, curious despite herself. Damien considered the question with unexpected seriousness. "Neither. You do not serve me at all, Grace. That is what confuses me most about you." Their conversation was interrupted by the sound of a car approaching the house, headlights sweeping briefly across the library window before cutting off. Damien rose immediately, his posture shifting back into careful alertness, and Grace felt the warmth of their conversation dissolve into the familiar tension that seemed to follow them everywhere now. Julian appeared moments later, his expression grim. "We have a problem," he said. "Victor Marchetti has requested a meeting. He claims he wants to discuss the ring peacefully, but he specifically asked that the appraiser be present." Grace's stomach dropped. "Me? Why would he want me there?" "Because he suspects you know more than you should," Damien said, his voice hard now, all traces of the vulnerability from moments before locked away behind renewed control. "Or because he wants leverage, and a witness to my mother's stolen property who can be pressured is exactly the kind of leverage he values." "You cannot let her go," Julian said immediately. "It is a trap." "I know," Damien said, "but refusing outright will only convince him he is right to suspect something, and it will not make Grace any safer." Grace stood, her hands clasped tightly in front of her to keep them from shaking. "Then let me decide. It is my life being used as leverage. I should have a say in what happens next." Both men turned to look at her, surprise flickering across Julian's face, though Damien's expression held something closer to reluctant respect. "What do you propose?" Damien asked quietly. "I go to the meeting," Grace said, though her heart pounded painfully against her ribs as she spoke the words. "But not alone, and not without a plan that keeps me from becoming a permanent piece on Victor Marchetti's board." Damien studied her for a long moment, weighing the risk in silence before finally nodding. "Then we plan carefully, and we do not give him anything more than he already suspects." As the three of them moved into the study to begin working through the details of a meeting that could easily turn dangerous, Grace felt the strange, unsettling awareness that she had crossed fully into Damien's world now, no longer an outsider caught accidentally in danger, but a participant choosing, with open eyes, to face whatever came next. Later that night, after Julian had gone to make arrangements and the house had fallen quiet again, Grace found Damien standing alone at the window of the library, staring out at the dark grounds beyond the glass. "You did not have to agree to let me choose," she said softly, joining him at the window. "No," he agreed. "But you earned the right to choose the moment you chose honesty over safety in your own shop. It would be hypocritical of me to take that away from you now." Grace studied his reflection in the glass, the exhaustion and worry etched clearly across his features despite his effort to hide it. "Are you afraid?" she asked quietly. Damien was silent for a long moment before answering. "Yes," he admitted, "not for myself. I stopped being afraid for myself a long time ago. But you have become someone I am afraid of losing, and I am still trying to understand how that happened so quickly." Grace's breath caught at the honesty in his words, and for a moment, standing together in the quiet library with danger waiting just beyond the coming days, the careful distance between them seemed to disappear entirely. Neither of them moved to close the remaining space, but something had shifted permanently between them, an understanding neither was ready to name aloud, though both felt its weight settle quietly into the room. Outside, the wind moved through the old oak trees once more, carrying with it the uneasy knowledge that whatever waited at Victor Marchetti's meeting would test not only their safety, but the fragile trust that had grown between two people never meant to find each other, brought together only by a diamond ring and the courage to do what was right. Grace returned to her room that night but found sleep impossible. She sat by the window, watching moonlight settle over the garden they had cleared together, and thought about how quickly the walls she usually kept around herself had begun to soften around a man she had known for less than a week. It frightened her, though not in the way the Marchetti threat frightened her. This fear was quieter, harder to name, rooted in the possibility that she might come to care for someone whose world could easily consume her own. She thought of her parents, both gone now, who had raised her to believe that honesty mattered more than comfort, that doing the right thing was worth the cost even when the cost was steep. She wondered what they would think of the path she had chosen this week, walking further into danger instead of away from it, drawn not only by conscience but by something else entirely, something she was not yet ready to call by its true name. Down the hall, she could hear the low murmur of Damien's voice through his study door, still awake, still working through the details of tomorrow's meeting with a focus that never seemed to rest. Grace understood, watching the sliver of light beneath his door, that whatever came next would demand everything from both of them, and that there would be no simple way to walk away from this now, even if either of them still wanted to. She finally drifted into an uneasy sleep sometime after midnight, her dreams filled with roses, diamond rings, and a man whose quiet strength had somehow become the steadiest thing in a week that had upended everything she thought she understood about her own life. The restaurant Victor Marchetti had chosen for the meeting sat on a quiet corner downtown, its windows darkened with heavy curtains that blocked any view from the street. Grace felt her pulse hammering as Damien's car pulled up outside, Julian already stationed nearby, blending into the evening crowd with practiced ease. "Remember," Damien said quietly, his hand briefly covering hers on the seat between them, "say as little as possible. Let me handle the conversation. You are here only because he asked for you, not because you owe him any answers." Grace nodded, though her mouth had gone dry. "What if he asks me directly about the ring?" "Then you tell him the truth. You appraised it and returned it to its rightful owner, nothing more. You do not know anything about his business, and you have no interest in it." They entered together, and Grace immediately spotted Victor Marchetti seated at the back of the restaurant, an older man with silver hair and sharp eyes that missed nothing. Two of his men stood near the exits, and Grace recognized one of them instantly as the taller man who had come to her shop days earlier. "Damien," Victor said warmly, though his eyes carried no real warmth at all. "And this must be the appraiser everyone is talking about. Miss Bellamy, is it?" "Yes," Grace said, keeping her voice steady despite the tremor she felt in her chest. "Sit, please, both of you." Victor gestured to the chairs across from him. "I only wanted to clear up a small misunderstanding. My men made an error approaching your shop the way they did. I apologize for any distress it caused you." "An error," Damien repeated flatly. You had my mother's stolen ring brought to an appraisal shop, presumably to determine its value before selling it. That does not sound like an error to me, Victor. It sounds like a plan." Victor's smile did not waver, though something colder flickered behind his eyes. "The ring came to my men through channels I am still investigating. I assure you, had I known its true origin, I would have returned it to you myself quietly, without any of this unpleasantness." "Then why insist on this meeting?" Damien asked. "You have already lost the ring. There is nothing left to discuss." Victor leaned back in his chair, studying Grace with an intensity that made her want to look away, though she forced herself to hold his gaze. "I am curious how Miss Bellamy recognized the ring so quickly. Most appraisers would have simply valued it and moved on. She, instead, identified it as stolen property connected to your late mother within the hour. That level of knowledge is unusual, don't you think?" Grace felt Damien tense beside her, though his expression remained perfectly composed. "I studied estate jewelry cases during university," Grace said carefully, choosing her words with precision. "Your mother's case was documented in academic archives I researched years ago. Recognizing the ring was simply a matter of memory, nothing more." "Fascinating," Victor said, though his tone suggested he did not entirely believe her. "And yet you chose to return it rather than report it through proper channels, or simply sell your silence to the highest bidder. That seems like an unusual risk for a woman with no connection to either family." "I returned it because it was the right thing to do," Grace said, her voice steadier now, anger beginning to override her fear. "I do not expect you to understand that, Mr. Marchetti." Something flickered across Victor's face, amusement mixed with something harder to read. "Careful, Miss Bellamy. I admire courage, but I have also seen it lead good people into very bad situations." Damien's hand moved beneath the table, finding Grace's fingers briefly in a silent gesture of reassurance before he spoke again, his voice hardening. "This meeting is finished, Victor. You wanted to see her, to size up whatever leverage you thought you might find. You have seen enough. We are leaving." Victor did not move to stop them as they rose from the table, though his voice followed them as they walked toward the door. "One more thing, Damien. Your mother's estate lawyer, the one who disappeared so conveniently 6 years ago. My men found something else in that storage unit besides the ring. Something you may want to discuss with me before too much longer." Damien's steps faltered for only a moment before he continued walking, his jaw tight, revealing nothing to the man watching them leave. Once they were back in the car, the tension in his shoulders finally broke into visible frustration. "He is lying," Grace said quietly. "Isn't he, trying to bait you into another meeting?" "Perhaps," Damien said, though his voice carried genuine uncertainty. "Or perhaps he found something real, and he intends to use it as leverage the way he tried to use you tonight." Julian met them a few blocks away, sliding into the front seat with a grim expression. "I watched the exits. No immediate threats, but 2 of his men followed partway before turning off. He wanted to see where we were staying." "Change of location," Damien said immediately. "Tonight, we cannot risk the house being compromised." Grace's stomach tightened at the thought of leaving the quiet stone house and its garden behind, though she understood the necessity. "Where will we go?" "Somewhere smaller, quieter, a place even Julian's contacts do not know about." Damien glanced at her, something apologetic in his expression. "I am sorry to keep uprooting your life like this." "You are trying to keep me safe," Grace said. "I am not going to complain about that, even if I am tired of feeling like I am always one step away from disaster." Before they left the old stone house, Grace gathered a few belongings quickly while Damien moved through the rooms checking locks and windows with a practiced efficiency that told her this was not the first time he had needed to disappear on short notice. Margaret, the housekeeper, arrived just as they were preparing to leave, and Grace watched Damien speak to her quietly at the door, his voice low and urgent. instructing her to take the week off and stay with family until he called again. The older woman nodded without asking questions, her calm acceptance another small reminder of how deeply the habits of caution ran through everyone connected to Damien's world. As they pulled away from the house, Grace looked back once at the garden they had cleared together, moonlight silvering the rose bushes now free of their tangled dead growth, and felt an unexpected ache at leaving it behind, as though something fragile and new had been interrupted before it had the chance to fully bloom. "We will come back," Damien said, noticing her expression in the rearview mirror, "once this is settled." "You do not know that," Grace said quietly. "No," he admitted, "but I intend to make it true regardless." They drove through the night to a small apartment above a shuttered bookstore in a quieter part of the city, modest and unremarkable enough to avoid attention. Grace found herself oddly comforted by its simplicity after days spent in the grand, echoing rooms of Damien's family estate. There was something almost normal about the small kitchen, the narrow hallway, the single lamp casting warm light across worn furniture. "This belonged to a friend," Damien explained, setting their bags down near the door. "Someone who owed me a favor and asked no questions when I called tonight." Grace moved to the window, looking down at the quiet street below, and felt the weight of the evening finally catch up to her. Her hands trembled slightly as she pressed them against the windowsill, adrenaline draining away and leaving exhaustion in its place. "You did well tonight," Damien said, coming to stand beside her. "Victor tried to unsettle you, and you did not give him what he wanted." "I was terrified," Grace admitted. "I know, I could see it, but you did not let it stop you from answering carefully, and that matters more than you realize." He studied her profile in the dim light. "Most people freeze under that kind of pressure. You did not." Grace turned to face him, close enough now that she could see every line of tension still etched around his eyes despite his attempt to appear calm for her sake. What did he mean about the storage unit? What else could there be besides the ring? Damien's expression grew troubled. "I do not know. My mother kept detailed records of everything, financial documents, correspondence, things that could implicate people who wanted her silenced. If Victor found something like that, it changes everything about what he intends to do with it." "Then we need to find out what it is before he uses it against you," Grace said. "We," Damien repeated softly, something unreadable in his voice. "I am already involved," Grace said simply. "There is no pretending otherwise now." Damien moved to the small kitchen and poured 2 glasses of water, setting one in front of her before sitting across the narrow table. "You should understand something about my world, Grace. Once people know your name, once they have seen your face at a table with men like Victor Marchetti, there is no quiet exit. I wish I could tell you otherwise, but I have watched enough people learn that lesson painfully to know better than to lie to you about it now." "I am not asking you to protect me from the truth," Grace said. "I have managed my own life for a long time. I can handle knowing what I have walked into." "That is not the same as living it," Damien said, though there was no condescension in his voice, only a tired honesty that Grace had come to recognize as rare in him. "I grew up inside this world. I learned its rules before I learned much else. You are stepping into it as an adult, fully aware, and that takes a different kind of courage than the kind I was forced to develop as a child." Grace reached across the small table, covering his hand with hers. "Then teach me what I need to know. Do not just protect me from a distance. Let me actually understand what we are facing." Damien studied her hand over his for a long moment before turning his palm upward, lacing his fingers loosely through hers. "All right," he said quietly. "Then let us start with tonight. Victor wanted to see whether you would crack under pressure. You did not. That tells him you are either very brave or very well trained, and he will spend the coming days trying to determine which." "And which is it?" Grace asked, a faint, tired smile touching her lips despite the exhaustion pressing down on her. "I think," Damien said slowly, That you are simply someone who has never learned how to be anything other than honest, even when honesty is dangerous. Victor will not understand that kind of person, because it does not exist in his world. That misunderstanding may be the only advantage we have right now. The silence between them stretched, charged with everything neither of them had said aloud since the garden, since the quiet evening they had spent trimming roses and trading fragments of truth neither usually shared with strangers. Damien reached up slowly, brushing a strand of hair from her face with a gentleness that contradicted everything Grace had heard about men in his position. "I did not expect this," he admitted quietly. "Any of it. Not the ring, not you, not whatever this has become between us in such a short time." "Neither did I," Grace whispered. For a long moment, neither of them moved, the space between them charged with everything unsaid, danger and desire tangled together in a way that made Grace's heart pound harder than Victor Marchetti's cold eyes ever had. But before either of them could close the distance completely, Damien's phone buzzed sharply against the counter, shattering the moment. He answered quickly, his expression shifting from tenderness to alarm within seconds as he listened to whoever spoke on the other end. Grace watched him closely, fear returning swiftly to replace the warmth that had briefly filled the small apartment. "What is it?" she asked the moment he ended the call. "Julian," Damien said, his voice tight. "The storage unit Victor mentioned. It burned tonight, less than an hour after we left the restaurant. Someone wanted whatever evidence it held destroyed before either of us could reach it." Grace felt a chill move through her. Victor. Or someone even more dangerous, trying to make sure Victor never gets his hands on it either, Damien said grimly. "Whatever my mother left behind, someone was desperate enough to burn it rather than risk it surfacing." Grace's mind raced through the implications. That means whoever destroyed it already knew Victor found it, which means Victor has someone close to him who is not entirely loyal, or someone close to you who is feeding information both directions. Damien's eyes met hers, sharp with sudden understanding. "A traitor," he said quietly. "Someone inside my own circle, or Julian's contacts, who knew about tonight's meeting before it happened." The warmth of moments earlier had vanished completely now, replaced by the cold, familiar tension of a threat neither of them had anticipated. Grace watched Damien's expression harden into the calculating focus she had seen during their very first meeting, the Mafia boss reasserting himself over the man who had gently brushed hair from her face only minutes before. "We need to find out who," Damien said, already reaching for his coat. "Tonight, if possible. Before whoever it is decides, you have become too much of a liability to leave alive." Grace felt fear settle deep in her chest, sharper now than it had been even during the meeting with Victor Marchetti, because this danger no longer came only from outside. It lived somewhere close, hidden among people Damien trusted, and neither of them yet knew whose face it wore. Julian arrived at the apartment within the hour, his face pale beneath the street lamp light as he climbed the narrow stairs 2 at a time. He carried a folder of hastily printed photographs, images taken from a security camera positioned across the street from the storage facility, capturing the moments before the fire began. "There," Julian said, spreading the photographs across the small kitchen table. "A car arrived 20 minutes before the fire started. Whoever said it knew exactly which unit to target." Grace leaned over the images, studying the blurred figure that emerged from the vehicle, face obscured by a dark hood, movements quick and practiced. "Can you identify the car?" "Working on it," Julian said. "But there is something else. The timing troubles me more than the fire itself. Only 4 people knew we intended to investigate that unit tonight. Myself, Damien, the contact who first told us about it, and whoever we discussed it with inside the house before we left for the restaurant." Damien's expression turned to stone as the implication settled over the room. "Margaret," he said quietly. She was present when we discussed the storage unit yesterday morning. I do not believe Margaret would betray you, Grace said quickly, remembering the older woman's gentle, weathered face, the quiet competence with which she managed the house. Neither do I truly, Damien admitted. But someone in this circle spoke to someone outside it, whether willingly or not. We cannot rule out anyone until we know the truth, even people we have trusted for years. Julian gathered the photographs back into the folder, his jaw tight. I will start digging quietly tomorrow. If there is a leak, I will find it before it costs us anything more than a burned storage unit. After Julian left, the apartment fell into a heavy silence, the earlier warmth between Grace and Damien replaced now by the shared weight of a betrayal neither of them wanted to believe was real. Grace watched Damien move to the window, staring down at the empty street below, his shoulders carrying the same exhausted tension she had first glimpsed in the garden days earlier, when he told her how lonely his world had become. Whoever it is, Grace said softly, joining him at the window, they do not know what they have started by pulling me into this. I am not going anywhere, Damien. Not now. Damien turned to look at her, something fierce and grateful flickering behind the exhaustion in his eyes. I am beginning to understand that about you, he said quietly, and I am not entirely certain whether that makes me relieved or afraid for what it might cost you before this is finished. Outside, the city moved on unaware, streetlights flickering against the empty pavement, while somewhere within Damien's carefully guarded world, a traitor waited, watching, already planning the next move in a game that had just become far more dangerous than either of them had imagined it could be. 3 days passed in the small apartment above the shuttered bookstore, each one stretching Grace's nerves thinner than the last. Julian came and went at odd hours, his updates growing more urgent each time, though the identity of the traitor remained frustratingly out of reach. Damien spent long hours on calls Grace was not permitted to hear, his voice low and controlled even when the words themselves carried unmistakable tension. On the 4th morning, Julian arrived earlier than usual, his expression carrying a grim satisfaction that immediately caught Grace's attention. I found something, he said, setting his laptop on the kitchen table. Financial records, small transfers, nothing that would draw attention on their own, moving from an account linked to Victor Marchetti's organization into a personal account belonging to someone inside your circle. Damien's expression darkened as he leaned over the screen. Whose account? Julian hesitated, glancing briefly at Grace before answering. Nathaniel. Grace watched Damien's face change, shock giving way quickly to something colder, more controlled. Nathaniel has been with my family for 15 years, Damien said quietly. He handled my mother's security before she died. He was one of the few people I trusted completely after everything fell apart. The transfers began 3 weeks ago, Julian said. Around the same time, Victor's men began searching the storage facilities connected to your mother's old lawyer. I believe Nathaniel has been feeding him information the entire time. Grace felt the weight of the betrayal settle over the room, understanding immediately what this meant for Damien, a man who had already lost so much to people who claimed loyalty while quietly working against him. Why would he do this? She asked softly. After 15 years. Money, Julian said simply. Or fear. Victor has a way of finding leverage over people, debts, secrets, family members who can be threatened. We will not know the reason until we confront him directly. Damien's hands had curled into fists on the table, though his voice remained eerily calm when he finally spoke. Bring him here, tonight. I want answers before Victor has the chance to use whatever else Nathaniel might still be willing to hand over. Julian nodded and left quickly to arrange the confrontation, leaving Grace alone with Damien in the tense quiet of the apartment. Grace moved to make tea, needing something to occupy her hands, while the weight of the coming confrontation settled heavily over the small rooms. She thought about the photograph Damien had shown her that first night at her shop, the young man standing beside his mother, so much softer in his features than the controlled figure who now paced the narrow apartment, and wondered how many other losses had shaped him into someone who trusted so carefully, so rarely, and yet had opened himself to her within the span of a single strange week. "You have grown quiet," Damien observed, watching her from across the room. "I am thinking about how much you have lost already," Grace admitted. "Your mother, the truth about her death, and now someone you trusted for 15 years. I am trying to understand how you keep standing after all of it." Damien was silent for a long moment, his eyes distant. "Some days I am not certain I do keep standing. I simply learned early that stopping was not an option available to me. My father died when I was young enough that grief felt like a luxury I could not afford. My mother taught me differently, to feel things fully even while still moving forward, but after she was gone, I forgot most of what she tried to teach me." "Maybe it is not too late to remember," Grace said softly. Something shifted in Damien's expression, a flicker of hope buried beneath years of careful armor. "Perhaps not," he said quietly, "with the right reminder standing beside me." She watched him carefully, recognizing the particular stillness that settled over him when his control was being tested most severely. "You do not have to do this alone," Grace said quietly. "This is not something I can hand off to someone else," Damien replied, his voice tight. "Nathaniel taught me how to shoot when I was 12 years old, after my father decided I needed to learn to protect myself. He sat with me through nights when I could not sleep after my mother died. If he has betrayed me, I need to hear it directly from him." Grace moved closer, resting a hand gently on his arm. "Then let me be there with you. Not because you need protecting, but because you should not have to face this completely alone." Damien's eyes met hers, something raw and grateful passing behind the careful control he usually maintained. "You keep insisting on standing beside me in situations that would send most people running in the opposite direction." "I told you before," Grace said softly, "I am already involved. That has not changed simply because the danger has moved closer to home." Nathaniel arrived that evening, an older man with graying hair and a weathered face that Grace recognized instantly as someone who had spent decades in careful, watchful service. His expression shifted the moment he stepped into the apartment and saw Damien's face, understanding immediately that his betrayal had been discovered. "Damien," he said quietly, no attempt at denial in his voice, "I assume Julian found the transfers." 15 years, Damien said, his voice dangerously quiet. 15 years, and you sold information to the man responsible for whatever happened to my mother's estate, perhaps responsible for far more than that." Nathaniel's shoulders sagged, years of tension finally breaking free in his posture. "My daughter," he said softly. "Victor's men found her 3 months ago, threatened her children unless I gave him small pieces of information. I told myself it was nothing significant at first, schedules, minor details. But it grew, Damien, it always grows." Grace watched Damien's expression war between fury and something closer to painful understanding, a man who knew intimately what desperation could drive a person to do. "You should have come to me," Damien said. "The moment they threatened her, you should have told me. And risk you making a decision that could have gotten her killed before you found a way to protect her." Nathaniel's voice cracked slightly. "I made a choice, Damien. A wrong one, perhaps, but I made it to protect the only family I have left." The silence that followed stretched long and heavy, Damien's jaw working as he processed the weight of an old friend's betrayal born from desperation rather than greed. Grace watched him carefully, understanding that whatever decision he made next would reveal something fundamental about the man beneath the careful control he wore like armor. She thought of her own father, gone now for nearly a decade, who had once told her that the measure of a person was not whether they made mistakes, but how they chose to answer for them afterward. She wondered if Damien had ever had anyone offer him that kind of grace, or whether the world he had grown up in only ever taught him punishment as the answer to every failure. Nathaniel stood silently, waiting for judgment, his hands trembling slightly at his sides despite his years of trained composure. Grace could see the toll the confession had taken on him, the way guilt and fear had worn grooves into his face long before tonight's conversation forced them into the open. "I do not say this to excuse what I did," Nathaniel added quietly, breaking the heavy silence. "I know the cost of my choice, whatever you decide to do about it. I only wanted you to understand why before you decide how to answer it." "Where is your daughter now?" Damien finally asked. Nathaniel looked up, surprise flickering across his tired features. "Safe for now, hidden, though I do not know for how much longer Victor's patience will last." "Bring her here," Damien said. "Both her and her children. I will protect them properly, the way you should have trusted me to do from the beginning. But the information stops now completely, and you will help us understand exactly what Victor knows and how he intends to use it." Nathaniel's eyes filled with something between relief and shame. "Why would you help me after this?" "Because I understand what it means to do dangerous things to protect the people you love," Damien said quietly, his eyes briefly flickering toward Grace before returning to Nathaniel. "You made a mistake, a serious one. But you are not Victor Marchetti, and I am not interested in becoming a man who destroys loyalty the moment it cracks under pressure it should never have been forced to bear." After Nathaniel left to arrange his daughter's safe passage, Grace found Damien standing alone by the window again, the same position she had found him in days before, though the weight he carried now felt different, heavier somehow despite the mercy he had just shown. Julian returned shortly after, having overseen the beginning of the arrangements for Nathaniel's family, his expression thoughtful as he studied Damien's composed but visibly drained features. "That was not the decision I expected you to make," he said quietly. "Neither did I," Damien admitted. "But punishing him further would not undo the harm already done, and it would not bring back whatever trust existed between us before Victor found a way to exploit it. I would rather spend my energy making certain Victor never finds another opening like this one." "And if word spreads that you showed mercy instead of consequence," Julian asked carefully, "some in your organization will see it as weakness." "Then they can test that theory themselves," Damien said, a hard edge returning briefly to his voice. "Mercy is not the same as weakness, Julian. I intend to prove that distinction to anyone who doubts it." Julian nodded slowly, something like respect passing across his features, before he excused himself to continue coordinating the night's remaining arrangements, leaving Damien and Grace alone once more in the quiet apartment. "That was not easy," Grace said softly, joining him. "No," Damien admitted. "Every instinct I was trained to follow told me to handle his betrayal differently, harshly, the way my father would have, the way most men in my position would expect." "But you didn't," Grace said, "because you are not most men in your position." Damien turned to look at her, something fierce and unguarded in his expression. "I am beginning to wonder how much of that is because of you, Grace. Before you walked into my life with that ring, I am not certain I would have shown Nathaniel the same mercy." Grace felt her heart clench at the admission, the vulnerability behind his carefully maintained control laid bare, in a way she had not expected from a man who had spent his entire life learning to hide weakness from everyone around him. "People can change," she said quietly. "Even people who believe they are too far gone to change at all." Before Damien could respond, his phone buzzed sharply against the counter, and Grace watched his expression shift instantly from vulnerable to alert as he read the message that had just arrived. "Victor knows," Damien said grimly. "Nathaniel's daughter never made it to the meeting point. Victor's men intercepted her 20 minutes ago." Grace's stomach dropped. "He is using her against you now, just like he tried to use me. Worse, Damien said, already reaching for his coat. He is sending a message that no one connected to me is safe, family or otherwise. This ends tonight, one way or another. What are you going to do? Grace asked, fear rising sharply in her chest as she watched him move with sudden, decisive urgency toward the door. Damien paused, turning back to face her, his expression a mixture of determination and something achingly tender that made Grace's breath catch despite the danger crackling in the air around them. I am going to end this, Grace. Completely. Victor has taken enough from my family, and now he has crossed a line I will not allow him to walk away from. Let me come with you, Grace said immediately. No, Damien's voice left no room for argument, though his hand came up to gently cup her face for one brief, desperate moment. I need you safe, here, away from whatever happens next. I cannot protect Nathaniel's daughter and keep you beside me in the same breath, not tonight. Grace wanted to argue, wanted to insist on standing beside him the way she had promised only hours earlier, but something in his eyes stopped her, a plea beneath the command that told her this was not simply about control, but about a fear too raw for him to voice aloud. Come back to me, she said instead, her voice trembling only slightly. Whatever happens tonight, come back. Damien pressed a brief, urgent kiss to her forehead before turning toward the door, his expression already shifting back into the calculating focus of a man about to face down an enemy who had threatened everything and everyone he had left to protect. I intend to, he said quietly. I have far too much left to lose now to consider any other outcome. The door closed behind him, and Grace stood alone in the small apartment, listening to his footsteps fade down the stairs, the weight of fear and hope tangled together in her chest as she waited to learn what the night would bring. She did not sleep. Instead, she sat by the window overlooking the quiet street, watching the occasional car pass beneath the streetlights, each set of headlights sending her heart racing before disappointment settled back in when the vehicle continued past without stopping. She thought of Nathaniel's daughter, a woman she had never met, caught in danger because of choices made by men fighting a war that had nothing to do with her own life, much the way Grace herself had been pulled into this world by nothing more than an old newspaper clipping and a decision to do the right thing. Hours passed slowly, each one stretching Grace's nerves tighter than the last. She tried calling Julian once, but the call went unanswered, deepening her fear that something had gone wrong. She paced the narrow apartment, replaying every moment of the past week in her mind, from the frightened morning in her shop to the quiet garden where she and Damien had cleared away dead roses together, searching for some sign, some certainty, that the man she had come to care for so quickly would return to her safely. Just before dawn, she heard footsteps on the stairs, slower and heavier than usual, and her heart leapt into her throat as she rushed to the door. When she pulled it open, she found Damien standing there, exhaustion carved deep into his features, a fresh cut above his eyebrow but alive, and very clearly relieved to see her waiting. You came back, Grace breathed, relief flooding through her so suddenly her knees nearly buckled. I told you I would, Damien said, his voice rough with exhaustion as he stepped inside and pulled her carefully into his arms, mindful of the injury along his brow, but unwilling to let even a moment pass without holding her close. Nathaniel's daughter is safe. Victor's men underestimated how far I was willing to go to bring her home. Grace pulled back just enough to study his face, cataloging every mark and shadow of the night's violence with careful, worried eyes. And Victor? Damien's expression turned grim, the weight of the night's events settling visibly over his shoulders. Victor is not finished. Tonight cost him men and resources he did not expect to lose, but a man like him does not simply walk away from a loss like that quietly. If anything, Grace, I believe this only guarantees that whatever comes next will be far more dangerous than anything we have faced so far. Grace held him tighter, feeling the exhaustion trembling through his body despite his effort to remain composed. "Then we face it together," she said firmly. "No more sending me away to wait safely while you carry every danger alone." Damien looked down at her, something fierce and tender warring behind his tired eyes. "I am beginning to understand that arguing with you about that particular point is a battle I am destined to lose every time." Outside, the first gray light of dawn began creeping over the rooftops, marking the end of a night that had cost them dearly, but had not, despite everything, cost them each other. Yet even as relief settled over the small apartment, both of them understood that Victor Marchetti's silence in the coming days would not mean peace, but preparation, and that the true reckoning between them had not yet arrived. A week of uneasy quiet followed the confrontation that had cost Victor Marchetti dearly, though Damien never allowed himself to fully relax into the stillness. Grace watched him move through the small apartment with the same restless vigilance he had carried since her first morning in his world, checking locks twice, keeping his phone within reach at all times, waiting for the retaliation he was certain would come. It arrived on a gray afternoon, delivered not through violence but through a single message sent to Damien's private number, one that made his face pale in a way Grace had never seen before. "What is it?" she asked, alarmed by the sudden shift in his expression. Damien turned the phone toward her silently. The message was brief, cold, and devastating in its simplicity. Victor claimed to have located the missing lawyer, Adrian Cole, alive and willing to testify that Eleanor Whitmore's death had not been an accident at all, but a murder orchestrated by someone within Damien's own family, someone who had wanted control of the organization before Damien was old enough to claim it himself. "He is lying," Grace said immediately. "Trying to destabilize you, to turn your attention inward instead of toward him." "Perhaps," Damien said, though his voice carried an uncertainty Grace had rarely heard from him. "Or perhaps he finally found the answer I have spent 6 years searching for, and he intends to use it as a weapon rather than hand it over freely." Julian arrived within the hour, having received a similar message through his own contacts, confirming that Adrian Cole had indeed resurfaced, currently under Victor's protection at a location Julian's sources were still working to identify. The three of them spent the following days in tense preparation, tracking rumors, verifying fragments of information, piecing together a plan to reach Adrian Cole before Victor could twist whatever truth the lawyer carried into something designed purely to destroy Damien from within. It was Grace, poring over old financial documents Julian had managed to recover from backup records before the storage unit fire, who finally found the thread that unraveled everything. Buried within years of careful bookkeeping, she discovered a pattern of transfers from Eleanor Whitmore's personal accounts to a shell company that, after hours of careful tracing, connected directly back to Damien's own uncle, a man named Alaric who had served as his father's closest advisor before quietly stepping back from the organization's daily operations after Eleanor's death. "Alaric," Damien said quietly, staring at the documents spread across the table, understanding dawning slowly and painfully across his features. "He always claimed he stepped back out of grief. I never questioned it, because I was grieving too badly myself to notice." "He wanted control before you were ready to claim it," Julian said grimly, studying the timeline Grace had assembled. Eleanor stood in his way. Once she was gone, and once Adrian Cole disappeared with evidence that might have exposed him, Alaric simply waited, letting everyone believe he had lost interest in power he intended to reclaim eventually. Grace watched Damien absorb the weight of this new betrayal, deeper and older than Nathaniel's, striking at the very foundation of the family he had spent his life protecting. "We need to reach Adrian Cole before Alaric or Victor silences him permanently," she said. "He is the only living witness who can confirm the truth." In the days leading up to that discovery, Grace found herself thinking often about Eleanor Whitmore, a woman she had never met but whose life now felt woven tightly into her own. She asked Damien, one quiet evening while they reviewed documents together at the kitchen table, what his mother had been like beyond the strength and beauty everyone always described. She laughed easily, Damien said, a faint smile touching his tired features. Even during the hardest years, she found reasons to laugh, usually at herself, at the seriousness the rest of us carried too heavily. She used to say that a family built only on fear would eventually collapse under its own weight, that real strength came from people who chose loyalty freely rather than people who were simply too frightened to leave. "She sounds like she would have liked me," Grace said softly. "She would have adored you," Damien said, reaching across the table to take her hand. "You remind me of her more than I think you realize, Grace. Not in appearance, but in the way you refuse to let fear decide your choices for you." The location, when Julian finally traced it through a careful web of financial records and old contacts, turned out to be a modest house on the outskirts of the city, guarded lightly enough to suggest Victor believed his secret remained safely hidden. Damien insisted, this time, that Grace remain close rather than sending her away, understanding now that keeping her at a distance protected her from nothing when danger had already proven it could reach anyone connected to him, regardless of physical location. They arrived at dusk, moving carefully through the quiet neighborhood until they reached the house where Adrian Cole had been kept for 6 long years, hidden away by men who found his knowledge more valuable as a weapon than as truth. The confrontation that followed was tense, but, to Grace's relief, ended without the violence she had feared, Julian's careful planning ensuring they reached Adrian before Victor's remaining men could intervene. Adrian Cole, older and more haggard than the photograph Grace remembered from her research, told them everything in a small, dim room lit only by a single lamp. He confirmed what the documents had already suggested, that Alaric had orchestrated Aliner's death years earlier, staging it to appear accidental after she discovered he had been quietly siphoning funds from the family's legitimate business interests. Adrian, terrified and complicit in hiding the theft, had fled rather than risk exposing himself alongside Alaric, disappearing into Victor Marchetti's protection in exchange for information that Victor had held in reserve for exactly a moment like this one. "I am sorry," Adrian said quietly, unable to meet Damien's eyes. "I should have come forward years ago. I let fear keep me silent while you searched for answers I could have given you from the beginning." Damien's jaw tightened, years of grief and searching crystallizing into something Grace could not fully name, grief and fury and finally, exhausted relief at having found the truth after so long chasing shadows. "You will testify," he said quietly. "Not to protect me, but because my mother deserves the truth spoken aloud after 6 years of silence." The following days moved quickly once the truth began to surface. Alaric, confronted with evidence he could not deny, did not attempt to flee or fight, seeming almost relieved that the weight of his secret had finally been lifted after years of carrying it alone. Damien handled the consequences within his own organization quietly, decisively, ensuring that his uncle would never again hold power or influence, though he stopped short of the violence others in his position might have chosen, a mercy that surprised even Julian, who had expected fury rather than the controlled, deliberate justice Damien ultimately delivered. Nathaniel returned during this time as well, his daughter and grandchildren safely settled under Damien's protection, his loyalty restored not through obligation, but through genuine gratitude for the mercy he had been shown when he expected none. He worked closely with Julian in the weeks that followed, helping trace the final threads connecting Alaric's betrayal to Victor's long campaign against the family. His careful, experienced eye-catching details that younger, less seasoned men might have missed entirely. "You gave me back more than my family's safety," Nathaniel told Damien quietly one evening as they reviewed the last of the evidence together. You gave me the chance to prove that my loyalty was real, even after I broke it. Not many men in your position would have allowed that. My mother taught me that people deserve the chance to make things right, Damien replied. I nearly forgot that lesson during the years I spent focused only on survival. I do not intend to forget it again. Victor Marchetti, stripped of his leverage once Adrian Cole's testimony became public knowledge among the families who mattered most, found his own position weakened considerably, unable to use secrets that no longer held power once they belonged to everyone rather than remaining hidden. Grace watched Damien navigate the fallout with a steadiness that told her the boy who had learned to survive at 12 years old had finally, after 6 long years, found the answers that let him begin truly moving forward instead of merely surviving each day as it came. It was nearly 2 weeks later, on a quiet morning with sunlight streaming through the tall windows of the old stone house they had finally returned to, that Grace found Damien in the garden, kneeling beside the roses they had cleared together weeks earlier, now blooming fully for the first time in years. They came back, Grace said softly, kneeling beside him among the fragrant blossoms. Everything does, eventually, if given enough care, Damien said, though his eyes were fixed on her rather than the flowers. He reached into his coat pocket, withdrawing the small velvet box that had started everything between them weeks earlier, the diamond ring catching the morning light exactly as it had in the old photograph of his mother. Grace's breath caught as he opened the box, though what he said next surprised her even more than the ring itself. This belonged to my mother, Damien said quietly. It represented a difficult beginning that became something beautiful, exactly the way she always described it to me. I spent 6 years searching for it, believing that finding it again would finally bring me peace. But it was not the ring that gave me peace, Grace. It was you, standing in your shop that morning, choosing honesty over safety, choosing to do the right thing even when every reasonable instinct told you to walk away. He took her hand gently, his own hand steady despite the emotion visible in his eyes. I do not want this ring to remain only a symbol of what I lost. I want it to become something new, something that honors her memory while beginning a future I never expected to find. Grace Bellamy, will you marry me? Grace felt tears rise unexpectedly as she looked at the man kneeling before her among his mother's roses, a man who had walked into her life through danger and grief and somehow, against every possibility, found his way toward something gentler on the other side of it. Yes, she said softly, her voice trembling with joy rather than fear for the first time in weeks. Yes, absolutely yes. Damien slid the ring onto her finger, and Grace watched the diamond catch the morning light exactly as it had in the photograph that started everything, no longer a symbol of tragedy and theft, but of a love neither of them had expected to find amid so much danger and loss. News of Damien's engagement spread quickly through the circles that mattered, and the following morning, as sunlight broke fully over the city, Damien gathered the leaders of his organization to announce not only his engagement, but his decision to step back from the daily operations he had carried since he was far too young to bear such weight, entrusting Julian with responsibilities he had proven himself worthy of through years of unwavering loyalty. The announcement shocked everyone who heard it. A man once known for his ruthless control choosing instead to build a quieter life, alongside the woman who had returned something far more valuable than a diamond ring. Grace stood beside him that morning, watching the surprise ripple through the gathered faces, feeling no fear at all despite the weight of everything they had survived together to reach this moment. She thought of her shop, quiet and waiting for her return, of the ordinary life she had once lived before a knock on her door changed everything, and found she did not miss that simplicity nearly as much as she had once feared she would. "Any regrets?" Damien asked quietly, his hand finding hers as the last of his men filed out of the room, leaving them finally, truly alone. Grace looked down at the ring on her finger, thought of Eleanor Whitmore's photograph, and the courage it had taken to give the ring back rather than keep it, thought of gardens and burned storage units and a betrayal that had nearly cost them everything, and shook her head slowly, a genuine smile spreading across her face. "None," she said. "Not one single regret. Only gratitude that returning something that was never mine to keep led me exactly here to you." Outside, the roses continued blooming in the morning sun. A garden once neglected now flourishing under careful attention, much like the two people standing together within it, finally free to build something lasting from what had once been only grief, danger, and the quiet, stubborn choice to do what was right no matter the cost. In the weeks that followed, Grace returned briefly to her shop, greeted warmly by Charlotte, who had kept everything running smoothly despite weeks of confusion and worry over her employer's sudden disappearance. Grace found she could not fully explain everything that had happened, choosing instead to share only that she had helped return a piece of stolen history to its rightful family, and that the journey had, unexpectedly, led her toward a future she never could have predicted when she unlocked her shop door that fateful morning. She kept the shop open, unwilling to abandon the honest work that had shaped her identity long before Damien Voss ever knocked on her door, though she now split her time between the quiet routine of appraisals and the entirely different rhythm of life, beside a man rebuilding his family's legacy into something steadier and more honest than it had ever been before. Julian took to his new responsibilities with quiet determination, proving himself precisely the kind of loyal, capable leader Damien had always believed him to be, freeing Damien to step back gradually from the world that had once demanded every waking moment of his attention. Margaret returned to the stone house as well, delighted to find the roses blooming again under new care, and quickly grew fond of Grace, teaching her small things about the house and its history that Damien, in his grief, had never thought to mention. On quiet evenings, Grace and Damien often returned to the garden together, tending the roses that had become, without either of them quite planning it, a symbol of everything they had rebuilt from the wreckage of betrayal and loss. Damien spoke more freely now about his mother, sharing memories he had kept locked away for years, and Grace listened, understanding that healing, much like the roses around them, required patience, consistent care, and the willingness to let something broken slowly become beautiful again. Their wedding, when it finally came months later, was small and quiet, held in that same garden beneath a sky painted gold with early evening light. Grace wore no elaborate gown, only a simple dress and the diamond ring that had brought them together, its history no longer defined by tragedy, but by the promise of everything still ahead of them. As she stood among the roses, watching Damien's eyes soften with an emotion he no longer bothered hiding from the world, Grace understood fully what her father had once tried to teach her, that honesty, however frightening in the moment, always led somewhere worth reaching in the end. And somewhere, she liked to believe, Eleanor Whitmore was watching her garden bloom again, her ring finally resting where it belonged, on the hand of a woman who understood exactly what it meant to give something back simply because it was right.